Hello and welcome to Straightforward, Levant TV's political debate show focusing on the Middle East. Since January 2011, Tunisia's political transition has gone through 4 phases. The first began immediately after President Ben Ali's ouster, when a series of interim governments culminated in the country's first free and fair legislative elections. This year, and in what was seen as a role model in democracy, the people had their say, and the Nida Tunis movement won the parliamentary elections. And as the country awaits its presidential elections, the economy, rising unemployment, cronyism and regional economic disparities, in addition to security concerns, are top priority. Let's welcome first our guest here at the studio, Ms. Hafsa Kara, journalist and political analyst. Very much happy to have you today. And Mr. Jalal Wergi, member of Shura and political bureau of the Ennahda party. You're very welcome on the show. And before we delve into our discussion today, let's have a look at this brief report on events in Tunisia.
The Arab Spring started in 2011 in Tunisia, and the elections were won by Ennahda party when former President Zain Abidin Ben Ali fled the country. Ennahda, or Renaissance, is essentially the country's Muslim Brotherhood branch. The Islamists have since fallen out of favour amongst the population and have conceded victory to secularists in this year's parliamentary elections. Results show that Nida Tunis, a secular movement that opposes Islamism, has taken about 83 seats by winning 38% of the vote, coming first amongst the main players. Altogether, the major secular blocs won 50% of the vote to Ennahda's roughly 30%. This doesn't even include tiny secular forces among the remaining 20% of the vote. This is a far cry from when Ennahda won with a plurality of about 41% in 2011, thanks to divisions amongst its secular rivals. After being in power, the Ennahda-led government was forced to resign under heavy public pressure, after which the Tunisian government included amendments that ban incitement of religious violence and demand political neutrality from mosques. Other amendments guarantee religious freedom, gender equality, and the liberty of conscience and belief. But unlike earlier phases of the transition, when issues of religion and state dominated the public discourse, the prevailing themes in the country campaign cycle will be the economy and security. Will Nida Tunis be able to address these issues? And with the cross-border smuggling that has undermined Tunisia's economic recovery and the threat of militants and arms entering the country, will the Tunisian government be able to secure the border with Libya?
Hafsa Kara, the economy and the balance between secularism and Islam was the key issue in this year's parliamentary elections. Does such a balance exist in your opinion, or is it more a compromise from both sides for it to exist?
I think at this first stage in the elections, it is very much a compromise. I think Ennahda have realised that what they were proning very early on has proved to be rather unpopular. And I think they've had to deal with the seculars despite, obviously, reluctance. At this particular point in time in Tunisia, I think it's almost a perfect balance, because we need to ensure that all fractions, in a post-revolutionary period, all fractions need to be respected and need to be heard. There remains a strand within Tunisian society that is still in favour of Ennahda. They lost, obviously, but it wasn't a crushing defeat. They lost by 16 seats, so we can see that their popularity, despite, the political assassination, the accusations at least, even though there are no proofs, but the accusations and the flirting with the Salafist movements, which proved to be very unpopular in Tunisia, despite all that, they still didn't suffer a crushing defeat. So at this point, it is a compromise, but it's a positive compromise, because I think it really is going to ensure an ongoing continuation, a smooth progression towards maybe a completely different landscape somewhere in the future.
And Jalal Wergi, security was the key issue in the vote. How did Ennahda fail to address security matters? In 2013, we've seen jihadists conduct political assassinations, and they even attacked the military in the country. So how did this happen?
I think speaking about failing is maybe a bit exaggerated, because in a transition era, we are speaking here about an earthquake in Tunisia in 2011, that an old regime has disappeared and the new one about to to be born. So we cannot speak about failing security. We are speaking about a country in a transition period, and we can see lots of instability, lots of insecurity as well. And it's a common responsibility. It's not the responsibility of a political party, but all the political forces and social forces as well, because yes, there is a polarization between secularists and Islamists, but at the end of the day, we succeeded altogether to build an experience, and we see this this success in the this late election, which is democratic, which is accepted by all the political forces. Even the party congratulate the winner of this election and accepted the outcome of this election. So I think if you compare Tunisia with what is going on around it and in the region, you can say that it's a real success and it's a real model, and we have to encourage this model to accomplish its tasks.
But back to security under the Ennahda party. Do you think Ennahda would have been in a bad position somehow, or in a difficult position, if it cracked down more harshly on the terrorists, on the jihadists, for example?
No, I think maybe it might be a bit better than what has happened, but I think it will not change completely, because, as you know, we are about a big change, an earthquake in the country. An old regime disappeared completely with its security apparatus and many other things. So we cannot say that Ennahda maybe did not do what must be done to control the security, because as you know, for example, in Libya, in Egypt, in many other countries, they are still suffering big issues of security. So Tunisia, maybe it could have been avoided some problem of assassination, and we agree that there is no that good experience in the state and running the government. So there are some weakness, but at the end of the day, I think it's a problem that you cannot, for example, say that Ennahda was not doing well in that period, and because Tunisia, especially Tunisia, external facts play a big role direct to the situation in Tunisia, especially the situation in Libya with the smuggling of
We will get into
weapons.
that in the next section, of course. Hafsa Kara, without coming across as undermining the political implementation or political practices of Islam, as you know, in a modern state, getting to power doesn't necessarily relate to your degree of religiosity. Do you think democracy will go to the next level at some point in Tunisia, where it would no longer be about secularists versus the Islamists, per se, especially given that 98% of Tunisians are Muslim anyway?
Well, this is really the big question, not only for Tunisia, I think, across the Arab world. We've seen the rise of political Islam as if Islam was something new in countries where they were overwhelming majority of Muslims. The discourse, of course, is that the previous systems hadn't worked, and therefore let's opt for Islam and see where it goes. But of course, in terms of implementing political Islam, it was as flawed as what the secular movements were offering already. And the only difference being that whoever opposed some of these political groups was being said, that they were almost blasphemous because they were going against the will of God, where in fact they were going against political parties that were working exactly like any other political movement. Now, if ever we're going to see a sort of separation or a progression of politics in in the way maybe we could see it here in the West, I think Tunisia would probably be the best example. I would have to agree with the other guest that Tunisia is going along a good way. I think for a country that has suffered a major revolution, I think we've seen political parties from very opposing views come together and discuss, and I think that's incredibly encouraging. When you look obviously at Libya, when you look elsewhere, when you look at Iraq obviously. So what is happening in Tunisia is encouraging, and I think if we are to see a real difference, a sort of a new way forward for the Arab and Muslim world, I think Tunisia is probably the country where it will start, definitely.
And now we are joined from Tunisia by journalist Rahil Mithnani. Thank you very much for being on the show.
You're welcome, Carl.
Rahil, tell us about freedoms in general under the Ennahda movement and any Islamic form of government. Do you think, tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. After the revolution, the country lived a total chaos. The sense of freedom has been totally misunderstood. The minority of people who were not used to such a notion abused a lot. The situation, Carl, increased after the victory of Nahda movement in the elections of 2011. And the country knew a new form of violence that raised with the appearance of terrorist groups. While people were waiting for severe reactions from the government towards the terrorist acts, the movement was covering them, pretending that democracy requires the coexistence of different sections, as being the striking characteristic of a mosaic society. Nahda has always been a good cover for violence practiced on liberals, journalists, actors, etc.
And Rahil, do you think this has changed the opinion of people so that Nida Tunis won the elections this time?
Of course, after 3 years of terror, murder of soldiers,
but you're saying terror. Do you think it's really valid here to accuse Ennahda of maybe Mr. Jalal Wargi here will have something to add? Do you agree that it was terror as such?
I think there is some exaggeration, and the media actually, a part of the media is the media of Ben Ali is still working, and because the revolution did not change everything, and accusing Nahda that adopting terrorism or protecting terrorists is not that accurate, let's say, because I think we are the victim of the terrorism, and the terrorism in Tunisia is not even appeared with the revolution before in 2009 and 2010, and Rahil can remember, I think that there is a clash between the security forces and a group of terrorists in the suburb of Tunisia, and 15 of them were killed. So we cannot speak about terrorism appeared after the revolution. And as we said before, it's a country in a transitional period, so lots of weakness in the security forces and in other many aspects of the government. So it's normal that when the security is fragile, terrorists come out and try to attack people and to do some chaos in the country.
Rahil, you can talk about the changes that happened in the country under Ennahda. How did these changes affect liberal and secular people and independent journalists like yourself?
Okay, Carl, but before I want to answer Mr. I don't know his name.
Mr. Wargi, Jalal Wargi of the Ennahda party
Jalal.
here in London.
Mr. Jalal, the problem with Islamists, I'm not blaming only Nahda, I'm blaming Troika and let's say Troika. The problem with you is that you don't accept the critics. When someone critiques the government, you think that he is the media of Ben Ali. I'm not a part of the media of Ben Ali. I'm just saying the truth. We did not leave terrorism as we lived it in the under the regime of Nahda. This is the truth. We cannot ignore it. We cannot say the opposite of that. You see, I'm okay that in 2007 there were terrorist acts, but the government of Ben Ali, the reaction of the government was so severe, but you did not react severely. So you have to assume and you have to accept the truth.
Yes, Rahil, tell us about the changes. What are the actual changes that affected you under Nahda?
Okay, under the Nahda, the country lived terror, a true terror, murder of soldiers, export of terrorists, threat of terrorist acts. People opted for a radical change by voting for a party that could bring back peace and security. And people found in Nida Tunis, though opposed by many citizens, the best refuge to build the country they dreamt of since the revolution.
Rahil Methnani joined us from Tunisia. Anything else you would like to add?
Yeah, before we close, Carl, I ask the government to put the folks on the border with Libya and take serious action to release our colleagues Sofian Shourabi and Navi Ktari, kidnapped in Libya since 71 days.
Rahil Methnani joined us from Tunisia. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
And Mr. Wergi, back to you. What do you think of the fact that despite the victory of Nida Tunis, it has not been able entirely to avoid entirely the reputation that it is related to the old regime, be it Bourguiba or Ben Ali?
Yeah, first of all, with the term what Rahil mentioned about the terrorism and the terrorism under Nahda, I think lots of exaggeration. I don't want, it's not true, but lots of exaggeration, because all the people know that Nahda tried to and killed many terrorists in different regions of the country, trying to secure the country. But at the end of the day, as we said, it's a fragile situation with the border with Libya and Mali and Algeria is not easy to control. It's normal that we can see some groups. They are even came from outside Tunisia to attack, and not only Tunisia suffered from this kind of problem. Mauritania, Libya, Mali, even European country, and we saw last month in Canada people attacking in the parliament. So we must not exaggerate. Yeah, there is an experience 3 years after the revolution. There are negative points, but I think in generally speaking, the picture in Tunisia is better and much better than that what Rahil tried to show about the situation.
We respect all opinions, of course. But back to my question, what do you think about Nida Tunis, that they are seen as somehow related to the old guard?
Yeah, I think everybody can say that some people from Nida Tunis, we cannot say all the people from Nida Tunis are the old regime. It's not true. There are people who were against Ben Ali. This is the truth. But there are some people from the old regime, and even Nida Tunis itself cannot deny that. But I think as far as everybody now putting itself within the context of the change and the constitution, the new constitution, new era, I think we can work together, and we want to overcome these kind of wars, the old regime. We are a new country with the new regime, and we want to work together, different forces for the future and the interest and the best of the country.
Hafsa Kara, assuming that promoting this sense of nostalgia to the previous strong state has helped Nida Tunis win, could this sensationalist approach be seen as reverse democracy, or, if I may dare quote Professor Sheldon Mullen, labeling similar approaches as inverted totalitarianism, where people might become commodities in their excessive political consumerism? Do you think Nida Tunis is going that way through the media, perhaps, or even through the speeches of Beji Qaid Sipsi recently?
I think it's a bit of both. I think there is a bit of nostalgia and they're almost feeding it because, of course, everyone, when things are going wrong, and of course the last few years have been difficult in Tunisia, there is always a sense of nostalgia for a past that seems to be happier, easier and everything. And in the case of Essebsi, it's actually even easier for him because he's not as much, when you say the old guard, he's not as much Ben Ali old guard, he's Bourguiba.
Yes, I meant both.
Yes, but of course, because he can play on that, he can play that he's not a sort of staunch Ben Ali guy, but he is more of the historical figure that is Bourguiba, whom many Tunisians now really, regret. I mean, obviously he was immortal and he eventually died, but the era of Bourguiba seems to be even more appealing. So I think this kind of current movement is playing on both. Now, whether to sort of see the Tunisian political arena come across and sort of capitalize on the sensationalist thing, I think yes, without a doubt, and I think we're seeing that across the Arab world. I think we're soon going to be seeing political parties, fly about balloons, show off their wives. There is this way of westernizing politics. I think that's inevitable because in a digital era of internet, of TV, charisma, and all these things play a part in politics. And so this is why I would argue that I think the two strands of the argument apply very much for Nida Tunis. Yes, definitely.
Very briefly, Mr. Wergi, would things have turned out completely different in Tunisia if the Muslim Brotherhood was still in power with ex-President Morsi in Egypt?
Let's say, as I said before, Tunisia is a small country with very limited resources. So the external fact play an immediate and direct effect on Tunisia and the Tunisian. And I think Tunisia is an open country, tolerant, moderate, and it's open for the different external player. In this term, I think what happened in Egypt has an immediate and direct effect on Tunisia. It's a positive role to press and put pressure on every political party to come together to negotiate, as she mentioned, because I think at the end of the day we cannot go through the country through this situation of fragility without sitting together, trying to see our country through, and especially in this difficult time of a transitional period. I think no one can work alone to overcome these difficulties, but we have to come together. And I think if there was no change in Egypt, maybe the main thing that we could see in Tunisia, that the old regime, especially many figures of the old regime, they could not have come forward and try to play a role in the future of Tunisia.
Let me now welcome Mr. Alexander Martin, Tunisia researcher, joining us via Skype from Durham. Welcome to Straightforward.
Thank you very much for having me.
Alexander, let's look a bit at civil society activism and attitudes during the 2011 revolution, seen also as the launch of the Arab Spring. How could we compare this to nowadays Nahda coming second? What has changed there in terms of the attitude?
Well, back in 2011, in January, and even before in December, activism was very focused, and against Ben Ali, everybody was pulling in the same direction. And then after Ben Ali's departure, then the civil space and civil society became much more fragmented and politicized. It was, there were groups who were supporting certain party interests or political views. It became a very noisy and sort of critical arena where people were expressing their discontent and dissatisfaction with the state and their situation. Whereas 3 years on from now, it's been learning to be a much less politicized arena, and where a lot of these groups are viewing political independence as a valuable sort of commodity and people who are aligned with parties, it doesn't reflect so well on them. Whereas with regards to what's happening in this election, the attitude perhaps is that Ennahda have not addressed a lot of the country's problems quite the way it should have done, in the sense that they have not fixed the economy in any ways, and that certainly this has already been touched on in the debate. The security system has not been fully addressed.
And Alexander, in your recent article, you argue that Ennahda still won the trust of the country. Why do you think so? And might this change under Nida Tunis, especially if the forthcoming president was close to them?
There are sections of the Tunisian population who will always be fundamentally opposed to what Ennahda stands for, being a religious-inspired political entity. And they will also argue that Ennahda's long-term goal would be something on the lines of Islamizing Tunisia. However, Ennahda have proven their democratic credentials. They have compromised and they have conceded points, such as the inclusion of Sharia in the constitution. They've also put Tunisia before their own party by stepping down in the time of political deadlock. I mean, by trust, I mean they have acted democratically. They have backed up their rhetoric. They will not necessarily be liked in any sense, but if they can act as an effective opposition now, and if they can be either cooperative when they need to, or if they're in the opposition, check the ruling coalition when they need to, then there's no reason why they cannot maintain this trust. With regards to the presidency, Ennahda are not running a candidate, so if Beji Faideh Sebsi wins, there's possible risk that the political situation will become more unbalanced and it will be much more in favor of Nida. So it's difficult to say what that means for Ennahda. Hopefully the president will be somebody who's more neutral so that the country does not become completely dominated by Nida politics.
Hafsa Kara, would you have anything to add to what Alexander?
No, I think it's a very fair portrayal of what's happening in Tunisia, and I think that just as there are many strands in Tunisian society who will always oppose, who will be fundamentally opposed to what Ennahda stands for, there will equally always be strands within Tunisian society who will always support some sort of conservative Islamism and will feel the need for that to be maintained. But overall, I do feel that Ennahda have played by the book, and I think this is really why we can see that at this point their defeat, as I said earlier, wasn't really crushing, and that they have maintained some sort of trust among the Tunisian electorate.
Alexander, back in 2011, we saw this rather remarkable excitement towards Ennahda, especially here in the West. Was the party seen as a force of democratic change or simply the only alternative to then President Zain Abidin bin Ali?
It's an interesting question, because at the time of the revolution, it was not really anything to do with Ennahda. It was just very much opposed against Ben Ali. The interest in Ennahda came because they are a moderate form of political Islam. But then over these past 3 years, they've been proven to be sort of cooperative and compromising. So this is contrary to the Western conceptions of political Islam as democratic groups who try to exploit democracy to stay in power. The situation in October 2011 was that Ennahda very much stood out amongst the 99 or more political parties. They were the most organized. Their campaigning was more effective. They went to grassroots levels. They went door to door. Admittedly, there are some allegations of people saying things like, if you don't vote for Ennahda, the doors of Gehenna won't be opened for you. The doors of heaven will not be opened for you. Whereas also there was the electoral system that very much supported Ennahda, because it was a closed list proportional representation where only the names and the logos of the parties were displayed. And at the time, Ennahda were the most known party amongst this sort of sea of disorganized groups. So the situation suited them very much. I don't think they were seen as any form of alternative to Ben Ali. It's just that the situation suited them.
Alexander Martin, researcher focused on civil society in Tunisia, joined us over Skype from Durham. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you very much.
Last month, President, the elections was an opportunity for Ennahda to learn about the realities of democratic accountability, where if you do not deliver on your promises, the voters send you home. Incumbent Islamists in Arab democracies were a novel sight in 2012 in Egypt and Tunisia. And in 2013, many analysts argue that they also revealed their amateurism in governance. But above all, there are lessons to be learned from Tunisia. Let's look into these and the way ahead for Nida Tunis. Hafsa, back to you. Let me ask you, the Nida Tunis party is very new in Tunisia compared to the Ennahda party. So do you think this would affect its performance?
Well, at this point, it's very difficult to say because we remain in a transitional period. Having said that, just to pick up on what the previous speaker was saying about Ennahda's role, I think the fact that they proved to be popular was that they were the oldest voice in opposition. I think that's very important to remind viewers that the reason why they won, not necessarily because they were promoting an Islamist agenda, but because they were the first people to vocally oppose Ben Ali at the time where he was at the height of his power. So I think that's really what made the Tunisian electorate sort of look to Ennahda as the most suitable alternative at a moment where elections were prepared. Now, whether this new party, whether they will deliver, I think it's too early to say. It's very difficult to say at this moment. But I think because there is a strong desire from all various factions to actually come together and really take the interests of the country above partisan interests, I think then it bodes well for Tunisia. It's difficult to say, again, especially because of the security situation, but I still think it bodes well because all groups are coming together for the greater good.
Mr. Jalal Wergi, what is Ennahda's attitude and morale during these critical times before the presidential election?
Actually, we see the election as a new success to the experience of Tunisia and in transition, and we believe that we can work together for completing this transitional period. We believe that there is no choice but working together and forming a wide political coalition government that every political forces have a say in it. So there is no shock, as many try to say, that the Ennahda party was crushed in this election. In the country, I think we succeeded. We have a great role that we have played during this transition period to reach the point of the election and to have a democratic election, and we are proud of that. And we are proud as well that we didn't oppress the liberties and the freedom of expression during our era. And we as well must mention that we didn't rule by ourselves. We have a coalition with two other secular parties, and we are proud of that experience. It's the first in the Arab country since maybe the independence that an Arab country saw a coalition between three political parties from different ideologies. So there are good things to build on, and we think that Tunisia is on the right path for the future.
Beji Qaid Sipsi wants to amend the transitional justice law that was approved by the Constituent Assembly in Tunis, finding it unacceptable, and he thinks it's retroactive. We're talking here about cracking down on Bourguiba opponents in the 60s. What do you think of that, Mr. Jalal?
I think it's better to look for the future, not looking backward. Everybody knows that Mr. Beji Qaid al-Sibsi has had an experience with Bourguiba, especially in crushing the opposition of Bourguiba, Yousfist political forces. But I think now it's a long time ago, and it's better to look forward for the future, working together. Especially everybody now is working within the context of the new constitution, the new change, and we all look for the future to work together for the interests of our country. And there is the justice that can, for example, if anybody committed crimes that must be punished, I think
Yes.
the courts are there, and it's an independent judiciary system. So anybody who was suffering in that period can go for the court and persecute whoever was committing a crime in that era.
Hafsa Kara, although the new Tunisian constitution was debated, written and validated and then put into action with the Islamists and under the Islamist and Nahda party in power, it still observed women's rights. So now today we see the country perhaps going back to secularism, yet the state comes first. The quote, I quote, prestige of the state, as per Beji Qaid al-Sibsi in his presidential campaign. He mentioned the prestige of the state. Now, how might this form a rhetoric that would disappoint perhaps the 2011 crowds that wanted freedom and equality, including, of course, freedom of women?
Well, this is the funny thing about the post-revolution thing. Of all the failures of Zain al-Abidin's rule, I think women's rights were never really an issue. If we can talk about oppression, I'd say men and women were equally oppressed under Ben Ali, so that was never an issue. But of course, they always had voting rights. They were present at all levels of society, and this was a very fundamental part of how Tunisia operates. So when Ennahda came to power, I think renegating on these past achievements would have been almost a nail in their coffin, because going back to these fundamental principles from which, Tunisians are incredibly proud. These were things that they've acquired through Bourguiba. It's never been under question. So coming back to that, there was never any question of that. I think what's proven to be slightly disappointing from the outside is that we haven't seen really prominent women come forward in the sort of political arena. I think that has been slightly noticeable from the outside, but I think we can still work. That is a work in progress as such, and I don't think that's a major issue. I think on paper, women have rights, and that means that should they choose to join the political program in any way and at any moment in time, that's never going to be questionable, and I think that's very encouraging.
And now let's talk to Dr. Khalid Kneni joining us from Tunis. Welcome to Straightforward. Dr. Kneni, now that the parliamentary elections are over, how is Beji Qaid al-Sibsi going to use the success that the secularist parties achieved in order to get to the presidency?
I think the first thing is that they will capitalize on the very personality of Qaid Sibsi himself, who has a charismatic personality and a long experience in different post-independence governments. The other thing is that he also was the prime minister just after the revolution, and he led the country to the first free elections in October 2011. Now, Sibsi and his party Nida will focalize on what they call the Tunisian model, which is based on three elements. First, women's emancipation, which is almost unique in the Arab and Muslim world, a free secular education, and a relative separation between the state and religion. I say relative because even Sibsi uses this religious rhetoric in his speeches. I mean, you cannot divorce the Tunisian personality from the religious
Give us an
rhetoric.
example where Qaid Sibsi uses religion in his speeches.
And almost in every intervention he uses, like Bourguiba used to do actually. They used one versatile, one element to justify or to focus on political situation or a particular point, okay? Without exaggerating, of course.
Yes, and Dr. Knani, we are witnessing a huge comeback not only to secularism, but also to Bourguibism even, and patriarchal values. If those values became more established under Sibsi, do you think this might marginalize Ennahda eventually?
First of all, I think the revolution itself is the product of Bourguibism, and the product of the state that Bourguiba created starting from 1956. I mean, the secular education, emancipation of women. And even the Islamists themselves, they are a product of Bourguiba. I mean, the Islamists in Tunisia are different from the Islamists in the East. You see that Islamists in Tunisia...
Well, how are they different?
Strategies.
Dr. Knani.
They make the necessary moves when they feel threatened.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, how are they different
Yes,
from the other Islamists in the region?
They are different because they are very pragmatic. They make the necessary strategic moves or withdrawal when it is necessary. For example, the Egyptian situation has played a major role in refashioning the Nahda politics.
Stay with us, Dr. Knani. We'll speak to Mr. Wergi of the Ennahda movement. How is Ennahda different to other Islamist movements, namely the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance?
Yeah, I think Nahda is more moderate and, you know, from...
When you say moderate...
1981.
Yes, what do you mean
when we announced this new political party, the Islamic movement, we accept the democracy and the game of democracy, and we mentioned that even if the people, the society in a democratic vote for a communist party, we will accept the result and work within this regime. So I think Nahda Party is a more progressive, more moderate, adopting the freedom of women. From earlier time, we mentioned that we accept what is being guaranteed for the women freedom in the Constitution of Tunisia and the personal code as well of Tunisia. So I think even we have an effect and an influence on other Islamic movement outside Tunisia, and we encourage them to adopt the democracy, the freedom of women, and to be more open and more democratic. And I think we succeeded in some point in this.
Yes. Back to you, Dr. Knani. Tell us a little bit more about the security concerns in the country at this stage. You know very well that they were a key issue in voter decision. Do you think Nida Tunis will do better than Ennahda?
I think that, first of all, the security apparatus has been weakened after the revolution. It has been infiltrated by different elements. And so the security apparatus in Tunisia is what the Egyptian army is in Egypt. I mean, probably the strongest force in the country. So there's going to be no economic prosperity without restructuring the security apparatus. For example, the main sector probably in the economy of Tunisia is tourism. There won't be any tourism in Tunisia without restructuring, reinforcing the security forces. People voted for security, I suppose, mainly for security.
And Dr. Knani, also lecturer at the Faculty of Arts and Literature at the University of Sousse in Tunisia. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Pleased to be with you. Thank you.
Jalal Wergi, how is Ennahda preparing for the next stage, especially when it comes to forming a new government when the new president is elected?
Yeah, actually, even before the holding the legislative election, we call for a wide political coalition government, because we believe that the country is still in a transitional period, and it's better, we must work together for the rest of the 5 years, so we can see stability and less polarization within the society. And I think majority of the political forces as well call for this to be a coalition government, or at least a non-political government, so we can see stability, because we don't want to see any division within the society, or instability and lots of strikes that will prevent the development and the economic to revive. So I think we believe that we are ready, and we congratulate the winner of the election, and we extend our hand to everybody to work together, because we believe that in the next 5 years, no political party can work by himself or can succeed in encountering the issues in Tunisia, especially in terms of security and economic crisis.
Hafsa Kara, last question. What are your suggestions for achieving a successful model in democracy and attaining security, of course, in Tunisia in this forthcoming last phase of Tunisia's spring during these very turbulent times in the Middle East?
Well, this is a difficult question, because on the one hand, I appreciate that a lot of the political fractions within Tunisia have done what needs to be done. I think they've worked in a positive way. They've agreed to work together. And we're seeing the results. You know, that the relative violence has been very limited when you consider the turmoil that is surrounding the country. That said, I think that a lot of fractions are sort of playing double games, and one of the main, I would say, errors of Ennahda, which has been similar to the one of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which has been to sort of play a slightly double game. So, for instance, while it promotes the idea of a strong Islamic identity and solidarity, we've seen, just like the Muslim Brotherhood failed to sort of be firmer with Israel and even close down the Israeli embassy, which they had been critical of for 30 years in opposition. The same with Ennahda. Ennahda, we've seen Rashid Ghannouchi flirt with various groups and people that are very bizarre. So, for instance, last year he attended a conference at the Haim Saban Center. You know, your viewers might be familiar with Haim Saban, who is a staunch Zionist supporter. You know, and the conference was chaired by Martin Indyk, former U.S. ambassador to the U.S. So the idea that the Ennahda, which on the one hand was supposed to promote sort of Islam and Islamic solidarity, was actually playing a bizarre game. And I think that the middle classes that had been supporting Ennahda, precisely because they are conservative deep down, were felt very let down by this double game from a party from which they didn't expect. So it was almost expectable from Ben Ali, but much less from somebody like Ghannouchi. Now, what to expect at this moment in time, I think, is for everyone to position themselves. I don't necessarily think that we need a plural movement to achieve stability and security. I think we need a very clear framework to work towards, and whether that's in the hand of one party, several parties, or no, that really is irrelevant. But the main thing is for the political parties to come together and agree on a framework and work together. Once that's established, I don't necessarily think that a coalition is important. It might be, but it's not really necessary.
The democratic transition in Tunisia remains young and vulnerable, but it is indeed the first democratic transition in modern Arab history that has taken root in an environment of sustained citizen activism, and it led other countries in the region to democracy-inspired uprisings. Supposedly, we do hope Tunisia leads the way again in prodding them not merely to yearn for democratic transition, but also to attain it. And as we leave you today, let me thank our guests here at the studio, Ms. Hafsa Kara, political analyst and journalist, Pleasure having you. And Mr. Jalal Wargi, member of the Shura and Political Bureau of Ennahda Party. Thank you very much for being with us. And of course, our interlocutors from Tunisia, Rahil Methnani and Dr. Khalid Knani of the University of Sousse in Tunisia. And from the UK, Mr. Alexander Martin joined us from Durham. And stay tuned, and we'll be with you again next week on Straightforward. Let's have a look at this brief report on events in Tunisia.
The Arab Spring started in 2011 in Tunisia, and then elections were won by Ennahda Party when former President Zain Abidin bin Ali fled the country. Ennahda, or Renaissance, is essentially the country's Muslim Brotherhood branch. The Islamists have since fallen out of favour amongst the population and have conceded victory to secularists in this year's parliamentary elections. Results show that Nida Tunis, a secular movement that opposes Islamism, has taken about 83 seats by winning 38% of the vote, coming first amongst the main players. Altogether, the major secular blocs won 50% of the vote to Ennahda's roughly 30%. This doesn't even include tiny secular forces among the remaining 20% of the vote. This is a far cry from when Ennahda won with a plurality of about 41% in 2011, thanks to divisions amongst its secular rivals. After being in power, the Ennahda-led government was forced to resign under heavy public pressure, after which the Tunisian government included amendments that ban incitement of religious violence and demand political neutrality from mosques. Other amendments guarantee religious freedom, gender equality, and the liberty of conscience and belief. But unlike earlier phases of the transition, when issues of religion and state dominated the public discourse, the prevailing themes in the country campaign cycle will be the economy and security. Will Nida Tunis be able to address these issues? And with the cross-border smuggling that has undermined Tunisia's economic recovery and the threat of militants and arms entering the country, will the Tunisian government be able to secure the border with Libya?
Hafsa Kara, the economy and the balance between secularism and Islam was the key issue in this year's parliamentary elections. Does such a balance exist in your opinion, or is it more a compromise from both sides for it to exist?
I think at this first stage in the elections, it is very much a compromise. I think Ennahda have realised that what they were proning very early on has proved to be rather unpopular. And I think they've had to deal with the seculars despite, obviously, reluctance. At this particular point in time in Tunisia, I think it's almost a perfect balance, because we need to ensure that all fractions, in a post-revolutionary period, all fractions need to be respected and need to be heard. There remains a strand within Tunisian society that is still in favour of Ennahda. They lost, obviously, but it wasn't a crushing defeat. They lost by 16 seats, so we can see that their popularity, despite the political assassination, the accusations
period, and we can see lots of instability, lots of insecurity as well, and it's a common responsibility. It's not the responsibility of a political party, but all the political forces and social forces as well, because yes, there is a polarization between secularists and Islamists, but at the end of the day, we succeeded altogether to build an experience, and we see this this success in the this late election, which is democratic, which is accepted by all the political forces. Even now the party congratulate the winner of this election and accepted the outcome of this election. So I think if you compare Tunisia with what is going on around it and in the region, you can say that it's a real success and it's a real model.
At least, even though there are no proofs, but the accusations and the flirting with the Salafist movements, which proved to be very unpopular in Tunisia, despite all that, they still didn't suffer a crushing defeat. So at this point, it is a compromise, but it's a positive compromise, because I think it really is going to ensure a ongoing continuation, a smooth progression towards maybe a completely different landscape somewhere in the future.
Jalal Wergi, security was the key issue in the vote. How did Ennahda fail to address security matters? In 2013, we've seen jihadists conduct political assassinations, and they even attacked the military in the country. So how did this happen?
I think speaking about failing is maybe a bit exaggerated, because in a transition era, we are speaking here about an earthquake in Tunisia in 2011, that an old regime has disappeared and the new one about to be born. So we cannot speak about failing security. We are speaking about a country in a transition.
Hello and welcome to Straightforward, Levant TV's political debate show focusing on the Middle East. Since January 2011, Tunisia's political transition has gone through 4 phases. The first began immediately after President Ben Ali's ouster, when a series of interim governments culminated in the country's first free and fair legislative elections. This year, and in what was seen as a role model in democracy, the people had their say, and the Nida Tunis movement won the parliamentary elections. And as the country awaits its presidential elections, the economy, rising unemployment, cronyism and regional economic disparities, in addition to security concerns, are top priority. Let's welcome first our guest here at the studio, Ms. Hafsa Kara, journalist and political analyst. Very much happy to have you today. And Mr. Jalal Wergi, member of Shura and political bureau of the Ennahda party. You're very welcome on the show. And before we delve into our discussion today,